talking to Paul Ruiz during the pre-show interview, you know, he was saying, I was looking at Kyogre and Xerneas, and so it's really cool to see that Paul has decided to opt for that Xerneas. And I think there's a lot of great supporting actors on this team as well when you think about the Volcarona, which is a very unique Pokemon in this format. And then you also have the Rillaboom, the Urshifu, the Incineroar, and then Amoonguss if you are under a Trick Room setting, which could be very useful against Ryota's team.
Yeah, I think, Paul's team here is very classic protect Xerneas, set it up fully. You've got 2 redirection users with the Volcarona and the Amoonguss, and 2 fake out users with Incineroar and Rillaboom. So it's all about just positioning your Xerneas, enabling it to get a Geomancy off at the right point. Whether or not you lead with it is another question. Ryota's team, on the other hand, some really interesting picks, right? He's got the Mienshao, the Arcanine, the Whimsicott, the Stakataka, and the Indeedee male, which isn't seen as frequently as, Indeedee female, but is a little bit more offensive and speedier. So partners really, really nicely with that Calyrex Shadow Rider. So one thing that's going to be, I think, pretty big in this matchup is potential terrain control, right? Like Ryota really wants to just ideally spam like expanding forces in psychic terrain. And so Paul can, obviously decrease that by switching in Rillaboom, set up the grassy terrain here. And so, yeah, I think I've also really got my eye out on Stakataka. That's really one of the best answers into Xerneas in this format. It is pretty interesting to see that on Ryota's team because the rest of the team is so speedy. So it's not like you necessarily want to set up Trick Room. But I think, for Paul, a lot of this matchup is about positioning. How do you get the Xerneas Geomancy in correctly? And for Ryota, it's basically about denying the Geomancy as quickly as possible. Mienshao is a Pokemon that does get access to knockoff. Whimsicott gets taunt as well. So there are a lot of ways to potentially stop that Geomancy from even happening.
Yeah, Xerneas is definitely one of those Pokemon that I feel like in past formats, you could just kind of put Xerneas in turn 1, have some redirection on the field, go for the Geomancy with the Power Herb, and just kind of go ahead and start clicking a lot of those Dazzling Gleams and just great attacks. But it's definitely more positionally focused in Series 10, especially without Dynamax. So let's go ahead and just jump right into the match and see how it all plays out.
The return of Xerneas. It's been a while since we've seen this Pokemon, but it is back with a vengeance. Let's see.
Ooh, we get a chance to see the Mienshao early on with the Shadow Rider Calyrex, and also we will see Paul lead with that Xerneas restricted as well, and of course that Rillaboom. So terrain control going to go into Paul Ruiz's favor at the moment.
Yeah, so this is definitely an interesting start to the game, right? With Rillaboom, you can't fake out into the Calyrex Shadow Rider. Paul also has to be very aware of a potential Mienshao switch out into the Indeedee. And so, yeah, you see he's actually opting for knockoff, which I think is a really strong option. Paul actually has substitute here rather than Dazzling Gleam as well. So 2 big kind of nuggets of information to start off the game immediately. So I think from Paul's end, you have to be very careful about clicking. You don't want to click fake out here, especially with Mienshao having inner focus. And so you also don't want to glide. I really like the decision to just try to go for a knockoff immediately. And so for Ryota, you have a lot of offensive options. And oh, look at this. Not going to go for fake out. Just going to start off the game with an Astral Barrage. And that's going to be so much damage.
Wow. Take Xerneas below half and Rillaboom to about half. But, the knockoff as well. That means that the Power Herb on Xerneas is going to be completely removed. So now Xerneas is locked into a 2-turn attack here with clicking Geomancy. But Rillaboom able to fire off now that knockoff, which is going to be enough to be able to knock out that Calyrex. But I feel like that Shadow Rider Calyrex kind of already did its job on Ryota's side.
Yeah, there were so many different ways that turn 1 could have played out. Like Ryota could have switched into Indeedee, doesn't go for the switch, predicting Paul to probably not go for fake out Grassy Glide. That's exactly what happens there. And Xerneas, had the opportunity to go for something like a Protect, for example, right? If you Protect turn 1 and then knockoff just KOs Calyrex Shadow Rider, you're in such a good position. But the thing is, Paul is probably not willing to make that play because you have to respect Mienshao just going for a fake out into your Rillaboom and an Astral Barrage. So Ryota finds kind of a clever play on this first turn and is now actually in a really interesting spot. You've got this Indeedee out on the field, and that can just, spam expanding forces. And right now, Paul doesn't have very good switch-ins into this expanding force. And we were talking about going into this matchup, a lot of it is about terrain control. Well, now you've got the Indeedee out, and Rillaboom is basically forced to switch out to try to regain terrain control. But switching an Amoonguss into an Indeedee never feels very good.
No, especially when that expanding force is going to be doing so much damage. And let's go ahead and see exactly how much damage it's going to do as that Indeedee goes for the expanding force. Oh gosh, it's going to be enough to knock out Xerneas, and Amoonguss gets so low. I don't even think that Regenerator is going to be able to help it very much, especially when you're just going to go ahead and get the Mienshao just to be able to attack into the Amoonguss. And yes, that is going to be it for the Amoonguss and that Xerneas on Paul's side.
One thing that's really interesting to note there, by the way, is that the Entity actually outsped the Mienshao and the Xerneas, so it's actually probably carrying a Choice Scarf. We have talked about Choice Scarf so much in the last 2 rounds, right? We've seen Choice Scarf Kyogre, Choice Scarf Regieleki, Choice Scarf Entei. Paul has a Choice Scarf Urshifu. Ryota has a Choice Scarf Entity. The scarves just keep coming. It's
so
summer right now, but it feels like the winter with all of these Pokemon carrying the scarves, honestly.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, that's something else that you can just kind of think about, like how weakness policy was such a pivotal item in a Dynamax format. Now it's Choice Scarf, right? You want that speed control all the time. And so whether it's, you know, having the Choice Scarf or having Tailwind, like we know that Ryota does have that Whimsicott that could be carrying that Tailwind as well. Well, Choice Scarf, you don't need it. So that's definitely something that you can look at and go, well, I think I'm really, really safe to try to go for some heavy attacks here.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, this game is certainly not over by any means, especially because the Urshifu here actually is Choice Scarf. So curious, you know, how both players have trained their Choice Scarf Pokemon respectively. But yeah, I think the tricky thing here is that you can actually knock out both Pokemon this turn. I think the Fake Out play is great. Ryota, of course, can capitalize by switching out that Entity to regain terrain control here. So Paul had the opportunity to maybe predict that and, you know, go for an attack and try to just KO whatever's coming in. But it is pretty tricky, right? Like, it feels like your Urshifu needs to stick around for multiple turns to really carry this endgame. So Ryota, of course, here could make the decision to just stay in with Entity if you're expecting Paul to make an aggressive read, but is going to just make the safe switch out here, and that's going to be Stack Attacker coming in.
Yeah, Stack Attacker, likely there is a little bit of a Xerneas counter, but, you know, Paul does go for the Fake Out just to make sure that Entity is not going to be able to get off an Expanding Force once again, even if it does switch. But here comes the Surging Strikes. That's so much damage. That's a lot more than what we got a chance to see in Sun.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now the Entity gets to come back in, gets to reset the terrain. And so, yeah, the main thing I'm curious about is just the speed interaction between Urshifu and the Entity, right? Like, if Paul is running Choice Scarf Urshifu, maybe you're not actually running max speed specifically to hit some certain speed tiers, and running into Choice Scarf Entity is probably one of the last things you would expect. So very curious basically on how both of the Pokemon are trained right now, because if Entity attacks first and just gets the Expanding Force off, well, then that certainly feels like game over. And look at this. There's also a Psychic Seed here on the Stack Attack. Now, it doesn't matter right now, obviously, against these two Pokemon, but that could be really critical in further games against Xerneas specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that, especially because when you look at the Urshifu and the Rillaboom, they're obviously physical attackers, and that Psychic Seed is going to boost your special defense. So not super important, I feel like, in this particular matchup, but absolutely pivotal and crucial in potentially future matchups to come. But it's the Entity that moves first. Oh my gosh, it's going to be able to get off a huge Expanding Force.
Wow.
That Urshifu going to be knocked out in one hit here, and that Rillaboom as well on a very, very interesting amount of HP here. Yes, it's going to be able to go for the Grassy Glide, but Stack Attacker goes for the Trick Room here, despite we seeing that Choice Scarf on the Entity.
Yeah, and I think the Trick Room makes sense, right? It's like Ryota's basically covering for if you end up surviving, or if the Urshifu actually ends up outspeeding the Entity, well, then you set up Trick Room and Stack Attack. It can outspeed both the Urshifu and the Rillaboom. I think basically what that turn boiled down to, though, was whether or not Entity, one, would outspeed the Urshifu, and two, if not, could still survive and then get an Expanding Force off. So this game should be over now in Ryota's favor, but that was a really critical turn. And the fact that this Choice Scarf Entity outspeeds this Choice Scarf Urshifu is such a big deal in this matchup. First of all, the fact that Choice Scarf Entity alone is really interesting. Not a pick that you see very frequently, but it's going to be very relevant throughout the course of this set. And yeah, a lot of interesting reveals here. I mean, Paul with the substitute on the Xerneas, you have the Psychic Seed on the Stack Attack as well. So definitely some creative choices in team building here, and I really love it.
Yeah, I love it too, and especially when it kind of, you have to think about what the meta might look like for an invitational like this, right?
Yep.
And so when you're thinking about teams and you're thinking about maybe counter teaming what the most popular restricted Pokemon could be, you definitely have to think about what supportive Pokemon you feel like are going to help you set up for success, and also what kind of restricted is going to really help you to gain that upper hand. So I'm definitely excited to see how Paul decides to adjust in this game number 2. I think there are a lot of ways that he can do that, especially knowing a lot of the major reveals that were on Ryota's team, and hopefully that is going to bring us into our first game number 3 today in this best of 3.
Yeah, so let's see as we get into the second game. To me, it's all about turn 1, right? Like, Paul lost Xerneas and got nothing off with it. So going for a Protect on Xerneas, even going for a Moonblast can completely turn the tides of the battle. So let's see.
Absolutely, but it's going to be the same leads here from Ryota, bringing in that Shadow Rider Calyrex as well as that Mienshao. And this time for Paul, we see the Urshifu as well as the Xerneas that we saw in that first game.
I really like the Urshifu mix-up here because Mienshao is just kind of tricky to go up against from Ryota's end if you're Paul. And so by bringing this Urshifu out immediately, you can just pressure either Pokemon with that Choice Scarf Surging Strikes, which is a really big deal, honestly. And I'm also curious if, because Urshifu maybe isn't as speedy, perhaps it has some bulk investment into it, and so maybe it can even survive like an Astral Barrage from Ryota's Calyrex here. So, the main thing here is now you cover for the knockoff, right? If Mienshao wants to go for knockoff, well, Urshifu's just gonna outspeed you and KO you. So that basically feels like Mienshao is more or less forced to maybe click a Fake Out instead into the Urshifu slot, but that does, give you the opportunity to Geomancy up with Xerneas. Looks like Paul's also considering protecting here, which can, certainly work as well, although you do risk Fake Out plus like an Astral Barrage turn 1. And so, yeah, I think Geomancy is the stronger play here, and Paul does decide top for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially though, we see the Fake Out from the Mienshao. And so Urshifu is going to flinch here as we do see the Astral Barrage on turn 1 come out from the Shadow Rider Calyrex. And that's going to be enough to knock out Urshifu and bring Xerneas so low. But this time around, we will be able to see that Xerneas get that Geomancy off without having to deal with the knockoff of the Power Herb this time around. So I think what's really tough here is that Ryota did go ahead and get that Grim Neigh boost on that Shadow Rider Calyrex. So those Astral Barrage is obviously going to be doing so much more damage in each of these turns. But Geomancy will help to make the Xerneas a lot faster, getting a chance to have that +2 speed boost as well as the +2 special defense boost and the special attack as well. So I think that, maybe Paul is in a bit of a better position with the Xerneas now, just knowing that he does have those boosts.
Absolutely, yeah, and even though Xerneas is at 50%, it's still going to be pretty difficult to actually knock out. And the main thing is that Mienshao just doesn't do enough damage. And I don't know if you saw that, Rosemary. This Amoonguss has Pollen Puff, so you can heal all the way back up, which is so cool right now, right? The Substitute is also a really interesting option. You can either go for Sub, or I would just probably go for the Moonblast on the Calyrex here. Moonblast plus Pollen Puff actually makes this really difficult, and I love that setup. The way Paul adjusted in this game was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially just getting that turn 1 read right, I feel like was so important. And Shadow Rider Calyrex just going to go ahead and go for a Protect here as Xerneas does go for the Moonblast. Not going to be able to get it off, but Amoonguss does go for the Pollen Puff here. It is going to be able to heal up that Xerneas to almost full HP. That is so important to see, especially when you do have the Geomancy boost. That Xerneas is going to be so hard to remove from the field.
Yeah, this was actually really well played by both players. You saw Ryota actually made a mix-up and brought Whimsicott in this game. If Paul did not have Pollen Puff there, you can then just Tailwind and Astral Barrage and likely just win the game from there. So it's so critical that Paul made the decision to run Pollen Puff on this Amoonguss. It actually makes this now so much more difficult for Ryota to win because there's no damage output coming out from Whimsicott or Mienshao, and the Calyrex is just going to get targeted by a Moonblast. So it feels like you need to really rely on Rillaboom, or sorry, Stack Attack if you're Ryota specifically. But even with Stack Attack, it can still be a little bit tricky. And then the question is, did Ryota actually bring Stack Attack out into this match, given the other Pokemon that have come out so far?
Yeah, that is a really tough call to be able to see, but we are going to see the Tailwind from the Whimsicott to make sure that that Astral Barrage goes off super speedy here. Xerneas does get taken to about half, Rillaboom more so, but Xerneas is going to be able to fire back with that Moonblast here right into the Shadow Rider Calyrex, and of course that is enough to be able to knock it out with that +2 special attack boost. So that is great to be able to see. Also, the grassy terrain here going to be able to help just heal up a little bit of HP for both the Rillaboom and the Xerneas. So that puts Paul into a much better position in this game.
Yeah, definitely. So I think if Ryota has Stack Attack, it feels like you kind of need to bring it out right now, but it's not going to be Stack Attack. It's going to be NDD, and that is a big difference maker here, right? Because now your remaining damage is a special attack rune in ED, a special attack rune in Whimsicott, and Mienshao. That doesn't really do very much in Xerneas. And so I think from Paul's end, he's contemplating the switch. I like that decision. Regain terrain control. If you have control of the terrain, NDD just really does not do very much damage. Also, by making this play, you're stalling out another turn of the Tailwind. And so I think that's a strong option as well. Either way, for Ryota, there is an interesting decision, which is you expect the switch and then switch out the NDD. But right now, you also kind of need to knock out Amoonguss. And so Paul playing this turn as safely as possible. I think even if Ryota just goes for Expanding Force plus Moonblast, like, the question is whether or not you can knock out the Amoonguss, but then you get a free switch in back into Rillaboom if you're Paul. So because Ryota didn't bring that stack attack, it's looking really tough to deal with the Xerneas in this end game.
Ooh, well, it looks like it's not going to be a double up here into the Amoonguss, so that Amoonguss is going to be able to stick around for another turn. The question is, you know, do you get a chance to actually be able to use the Pollen Puff? I feel like you do have to kind of bring out the Rillaboom here, hope that Xerneas is going to be able to get off some big damage with a Moonblast right now, and just be able to take out that big threat, especially knowing that Tailwind is going to expire soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing here that might make the endgame a little bit trickier for Paul is that he's not running Dazzling Gleam, meaning that you have to use that single target Moonblast, and with the potential, you know, Focus Sash in multiple different places, like that's the main thing you'd have to watch out for. Although, I think, yeah, like, because there's both Mienshao and Whimsicott on the team, like obviously only one of those can run that Focus Sash, right? And so, yeah, in this position, like, we are going to see the switch. I actually really like that play. And I think, like, at this point, your best option might be, yeah, you make that switch. This is what I was trying to talk about earlier, where then you regain terrain control. And then Whimsicott can just try to go for a Moonblast, either KO the Rillaboom so that you have full terrain control, or maybe go for a critical hit onto the Xerneas. Either okay.
Well, that Moonblast is going to be directed at the Xerneas here. Not going to be that critical hit that Ryota was probably hoping for, especially now that the Moonblast is going to go right into the Mienshao for super effective damage. But we do see the reveal of that Focus Sash on the Mienshao, so it will be able to hang on with 1 HP and just a little bit more than that because of the grassy terrain.
Yeah, so I think, you know, Paul will take that trade any day. Yes, the NDD is switched out, but the thing is, if you knock out Whimsicott, now we know Whimsicott doesn't have Focus Sash. If you KO the Whimsicott and it can't set up another Tailwind, then your Xerneas will obviously just outspeed the NDD, right? So much of this is just switching back and forth, positioning. You can fake out the Whimsicott and Moonblaster right now, so it's like even if Xerneas goes for a fake out onto the Mienshao fakes out into Xerneas, well then you deny Whimsicott an attack, and then the next turn you can just Moonblast and Grassy Glide. So I think Paul in a pretty good spot right now. I like the play Ryota was attempting there because it's like if you stay in with the NDD, what are you really doing? Clicking Expanding Force doesn't really do any damage into Xerneas anyway, so it feels like you're more or less forced to make that switch if you're Ryota.
Well, the fake out's going to be able to connect onto the Whimsicott, so even if Ryota was going for the Tailwind there, it's not going to be able to get it off, and we will see the Mienshao go for that close combat right into the Rillaboom, so Rillaboom is going to get knocked out here, but that means a free switch into the Amoonguss that is going to be in the back. Moonblast now going to be able to connect onto the Whimsicott, and that is enough damage, so now no more Tailwind for Ryota here, especially after that phenomenal play by Paul. I feel like the adjustments that Paul has made for this second game, I'm excited about getting a chance to potentially see a third game in this match.
For sure, yeah, and I mean, at this point, you can bring out the Amoonguss, right? You've got this speedy Xerneas. I think, like, Ryota had the opportunity to maybe click close combat that turn into the Xerneas, but I think his best bet is just hope, okay, well, I knock out the Rillaboom, I get terrain control, and then I can just click Expanding Force. But now if you're Paul, right, like, you can just go for Protects with both Pokemon, stall out another turn to Tailwind, and then really go from there. Actually, Tailwind is already stalled out, so you don't even need to stall it out. You can just click Moonblast at this point. You know your Choice Scarf on the opposing NDD, so you can just Moonblast that slot safely, always outspeed. The main thing here, I think if you're Ryota, is, yeah, whether or not you want to reveal any information, like whether or not the Mienshao has Wide Guard would be really interesting, because one win con for Ryota would be to hope that Paul messes up and clicks Dazzling Gleam, but I think, you know, you're going up against a world champion. He's not going to make that misplay, and so even if you have Wide Guard, probably not worth it to try to, you know, go for it there. And in the end, it's all about the Xerneas, and I think the main thing that we really have to talk about is the Pollen Puff. If Paul does not have Pollen Puff with the Amoonguss, Ryota actually made the brilliant adjustment of bringing Whimsicott, but unfortunately, it didn't actually end up working out because the Amoonguss was just able to heal the Xerneas. Now, if you don't have Pollen Puff on Amoonguss, the Xerneas will likely just faint to that second Astral Barrage, right? Because it got that Grenade boost earlier. And so sometimes, like, it can really boil down to just even a single move. And so Pollen Puff's such a great team building decision from Paul to bring here. And Ryota, in the end, not bringing that stack attack, doesn't have really the best answer into the Xerneas and ends up getting punished for it.
Yeah, especially because Gyro Ball would do so much more damage with that Geomancy boost as well. But something else that I wanted to bring up is that Regenerator ability on Amoonguss actually really helped it to be able to go for those Rage Powders very safely in the end game, so that you weren't going to be taking too much damage from that close combat coming out from the Mienshao or any other attack that the Mienshao would have been able to offer. So I really love the way that Paul played that positional game in game number 2, and that was the exact adjustment I feel like we needed to see him make in order for us to go into a game 3.
For sure. I think the main thing is the lead, right? Like, I really like the Urshifu plus Xerneas lead, because what that said was basically, okay, you're either gonna click knock off. I mean, you can't really knock off, basically. If you do, the Surging Strikes will just KO you, because, yeah, Paul can always safely launch Surging Strikes into Mienshao. And so I think it was just a really smart decision to basically say, hey, I'm gonna trade some Pokemon, but I'm gonna get this Geomancy boost off. And once again, having Amoonguss to switch in for Paul and Puff is really critical. So for Ryota, I think maybe you rethink the leads a little bit. Instead of leading the Mienshao, which doesn't do very much if it doesn't get knockoff off, you can drop it, maybe bring Whimsicott. Stack Attack is also like super interesting, because it didn't even come out in that last game, and it felt like it could have been the difference maker, especially with that Psychic Seed. And so I'd like to see Ryota mix it up a little bit, maybe not lead the Mienshao, but we'll have to see which decision he goes with in this third game.
Let's go ahead and jump right into it then and see what this game 3 has in store for us. It is currently 1-1 in this best of 3 between Ryota, Otsubo and Paul Ruiz here. We are going to see a restricted lead come out from Ryota as well as Paul. So Paul kind of going with the if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality, knowing that Xerneas and Urshifu was a very strong lead. But I feel like the adjustment here on Ryota's side is that you can get Tailwind off very early now.
Exactly. That's exactly the adjustment I think Ryota needed to make here. And so, yeah, it doesn't bring the Mienshao again, and I think this gives him a significant advantage going into the first turn here, right? You can just go for something like a Tailwind and a Astral Barrage here. And so Paul recognizes, hey, I can't really set up Geomancy very safely, and I have to respect the potential taunt from the Whimsicott as well. So, yeah, just going for the Moonblast, which I do like.
Yeah, I really like that as well, but the Astral Barrage, because of the Tailwind, is going to go off first, and that is going to be a knockout onto the Urshifu, and again, a significant chunk of damage onto the Xerneas. Grenade boost now coming out for that Shadow Rider Calyrex to raise its special attack here, and of course that Life Orb going to be doing a little bit of recoil, but let's see if that's enough for this Xerneas to be able to get the knockout with the Moonblast here, and it is not. Ooh, but you do get the special attack drop, so going back to neutral here.
Yeah, special attack drop there could definitely be a difference maker. Once again, I like Paul's decision to not go for the Geomancy here, I think, because one, you risk taunt from Whimsicott. Two, even if you get the Geomancy off, you know that Ryota's going to set up Tailwind this time around, so then the Calyrex Shadow Rider is still going to outspeed you. So now Ryota's in an interesting spot, right? If you've got the Indeedee, you can obviously consider switching Whimsicott out into Indeedee and then going for something like an Expanding Force. However, Paul, of course, can get around that by just protecting the Xerneas and then knocking out the Calyrex Shadow Rider with Rillaboom. And so I think a big decision here is for Calyrex, do you go for a protect, expecting the Xerneas to protect here, right? Even if you get one more attack off with this Calyrex Shadow Rider into both Pokemon, that's a really big deal. So this is, I think, actually a very critical turn here. U-turn on Paul's Rillaboom is also really interesting because it allows you to pivot out and back in, and we've seen how big the terrain wars between the Indeedee and the Rillaboom are in this matchup.
Yeah.
So my main question here is, does Paul protect the Xerneas this turn?
Well, we're about to find out here. Oh, it does look like Paul is going to go for the protect, but is it going to pay off? Whimsicott going to get switched out here on Ryota's side, and we are going to see that Indeedee come back in, which will set up the Psychic Terrain with that Psychic Surge ability and just regain terrain control for Ryota. Now, Xerneas will go ahead and protect like we saw it hover over in that team preview, and Expanding Force now. Ooh, interesting. I mean, Shadow Rider Calyrex usually goes ahead and has that Expanding Force, but that's so much damage onto the Rillaboom there.
Yeah, so much damage, and it's actually really critical that Paul went for a U-turn here. Really the best option, but if you don't go for the U-turn there and you go for Grassy Glide, you're actually in really bad shape if you're Paul, because suddenly Ryota has gotten out the Choice Scarf Indeedee and has terrain control. So I can't stress how important it is that the U-turn actually came out there. So this is definitely a really interesting position at this point because you, if you're Paul, can actually regain control of the terrain. Now, if you knock out one more Pokemon, you could potentially have, grassy terrain for the remainder of the battle as well. And while the Xerneas is obviously quite low while you're staring down this Indeedee, the Amoonguss does have Pollen Puff, so it can heal the Xerneas back up a little bit. And so that's really critical. I mean, if you're Ryota right now, I think you can just bring the Whimsicott out and then just go for like a Moonblast onto the Xerneas. And then Expanding Force, but then the thing is, now Paul potentially threatens the Indeedee with Spore. And so even though Amoonguss is, doesn't love going up against Indeedee, the reality is that it can survive an Expanding Force and maybe even an Expanding Force plus Moonblast, which is a really big deal because it means that even if you just put one of Ryota's Pokemon to sleep, you can completely turn the momentum of the battle back into your favor.
Absolutely. I think that's... Oh, but a Manshao now. That makes things very interesting for how Paul is going to play out this next turn, I feel like.
Yeah, I was expecting Ryota to maybe bring that Stack Attack up, but it actually ends up bringing Mienshao in the back, and I think that actually makes it a lot more difficult. It feels like if Stack Attack were in the back, Ryota would have a much easier endgame position here, but because it's Mienshao, Mienshao's not really doing very much damage, right? And so right now, I think Paul's play makes a lot of sense. You really need to rechange the terrain, not only to, one, get your grassy terrain up and get rid of the psychic terrain, but two, also make sure that Expanding Force doesn't hit both targets, right? Part of the strength of this Choice Scarf Indeedee is that you can safely click Expanding Force, and know that you can just target both Pokemon, but the switch in and Ryota trying to read into the Rillaboom switch in. Okay.
Wow.
Let's see how much this actually pays off though.
Yeah, bringing the Whimsicott back out here. I think also it's important that Ryota still regains speed control in some amount of way, but we are going to see the Xerneas switch out for the Rillaboom, reset the terrain here, but Ryota smartly identifying that you can go ahead and terrain control is going to go back in Ryota's favor. That knockoff from the Mienshao is going to be plenty to be able to knock it out. And oh man, the switch as well. Oh, the Spore's not going to be able to work into the Whimsicott.
That was a really, really great play by Ryota. Now, I think, Paul is kind of limited in his options there, right? So it's like Paul could take the very aggressive route of predicting Ryota's Indeedee to switch out, but Ryota basically is like, okay, I have the pressure right now on this specific turn, and I think it's very likely you're going to switch out, so I'm basically just trying to go one step ahead and read into that. And so that's a really, really critical turn there, as like you mentioned, now Ryota can get that terrain control, right? The main thing to be scared of, though, is that the Xerneas can still be healed up by Amoonguss and the Pollen Puff. So I'm curious if this Whimsicott actually has something like a taunt, right? If you can taunt the Amoonguss. Well, actually, Pollen Puff is an attacking move anyway, so it doesn't even matter there. So Paul's not out of it by any means, because you can still potentially get the Geomancy off. You still can heal the Xerneas as well. And Xerneas does very well offensively into Ryota's entire team at this point, even without Geomancy.
Absolutely, especially knowing that the Stack Attacka isn't on Ryota's side of the field, or it wasn't even brought to this game number 3. I feel like you can very safely go for things like that. And oh my gosh, the Protect from Paul, so impactful here, as you can just go for the Spore into the Mienshao and put it right to sleep. That was such a great turn for Paul.
That was, a really safe turn there. Like, the main thing is whether or not Ryota actually has taunt. If you don't, he actually can't even do anything into the Amoonguss right now. So the main thing is how the positioning worked out here. And Ryota maybe had the opportunity to switch one of the Pokemon out into Indeedee, but now this Mienshao is completely useless. So yeah, I mean, the main thing here is, can the Whimsicott actually get a KO with Moonblast onto Xerneas? The Fairy Aura is up. Xerneas is a relatively bulky Pokemon, even without any investment. So if you don't get the knockout, then the Amoonguss can just keep healing the Xerneas at this point, right? The main question I have is really the rest of the Whimsicott's moveset. And we're actually going to see the Mienshao switch out this turn, but wondering if that's maybe one turn too late.
Especially because of the Spore putting it to sleep. And this is very, very safe for Paul to go for the Geomancy here, because you can kind of predict that Ryota could go for the switch here. But we're about to find out whether or not this Moonblast is going to be enough to knock out the Xerneas.
Oh,
it's not! Oh my gosh! It's going to hang on. That Geomancy is going to be able to go here. And that is going to be so good for Paul, especially knowing that you are able to heal up that Xerneas with that Pollen Puff this turn.
such a big deal there. I mean, yeah, I think Ryota making the right switch there with the hope that, okay, well, I bring in Indy now, I've got the Choice Scarf Indy out, then I can just Tailwind with the Whimsicott. But this Pollen Puff on Amoonguss is so clutch, right? If Paul doesn't have Pollen Puff, both this game and, game 2 is really tricky to win because Ryota can just match the Xerneas by doing a lot of damage and then just finishing it off. But the thing is, Paul has been able to get these Geomancy setups and not lose that much HP with Xerneas specifically because of the Pollen Puff. So really, really great outcome there. And now I think if you're Ryota, you're basically hoping for a Tailwind and a critical hit Expanding Force onto Xerneas. If you don't get the crit, the game feels more or less over.
Yeah, especially because with that Geomancy, that Xerneas is going to be at +2 special defense, and we're about to find out how much that's going to save that Xerneas. Oh my gosh, that's so big for Paul to be able to fire back with a Moonblast here. Even though Ryota does get up the Tailwind, we know that that Focus Sash is not on that Whimsicott, so that is going to be enough to knock it out. And another Spore here. It's going to connect onto the Indeedee, so now the Indeedee and the Mienshao that are left are both asleep.
And that basically feels like it's a wrap, right? At this point, you can just go for a Moonblast. The Pollen Puff is just so good, right? It's like frustrating if you're in Ryota's end where it's like, the Xerneas is so low. It's just one attack away from getting KO'd, and then the Moongus just heals it all the way back up. But I actually think this was just a phenomenal set by both players. I really, really love the adjustments both players made. And great team building. I think the Pollen Puff is really the difference maker here, right? And so both Pokemon are going to take a turn to sleep. And I think, it's correct to Moonblast into Indeedee there. That's the thing, like, you crit you with an Expanding Force, and it's scary. A Mienshao crit close combat isn't going to KO the Xerneas once you're healed up anyway.
Right.
And so that's, not as much of a threat. With this Pollen Puff off now into Xerneas, that more or less should secure the game up for Paul. But really, really fun game here. I mean, I love the Whimsicott adjustment that Ryota made, but I think the main thing here is that Mienshao as the fourth just wasn't very impactful. I'm kind of surprised to see that over Stakataka, which typically is really one of the best answers into the Xerneas.
Yeah, I'm really surprised that Stakataka got left at home as well. I felt like the Mienshao wasn't necessarily able to put on the same offensive pressure that you were hoping that it would be able to do in this match, especially in games 2 and 3. So that does surprise me a lot, especially when Stakataka was able to just kind of clean up Ryota's game number 1. Of course, that Pollen Puff will be able to do damage to opposing Pokemon, and so even though Mienshao did have that Focus Sash, that is